We're at.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a combined hearing of the Budget and Tax Committee and the Education, Health, and Environment Affairs Committees. We have one bill to take up today. It's been presented and will be presented by the President of the Senate, Senate Bill 965. Of course, the President, and then Chairman Pinsky will also be making comments about that afterwards. We'll then have a detailed presentation by Rachel Heiss with our Department of Legislative Services. And then we have a number of individuals who are going to testify. We'll use our standard rules in that the individuals who are going to be testifying, you have 2.5 minutes. And I don't know what education's rules are, but we have sort of the voice from above. And I assume we've got that person there. When you come up close to your time, you'll hear that your time is just about expired. We'll let you finish up your thought, and then we move on to the next testifier. So with that, obviously we have had quite a year to learn a lot of things about the blueprint. And this bill will be addressing, I think, a lot of what we've learned. And I'll ask the Senate President certainly share his thoughts.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of Budget and Tax and Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I sit here today with bated breath, waiting to hear our 6-year-old went back in person for 2 hours today. So I'm waiting to get the call to see just how that went. But talk about an odd year when on March 15th is the first day back in real person school. And when I dropped her off at our little pod this morning, her comment to me was, "Dad, can you even believe that I haven't seen my classroom yet?" And I thought about it for a second, and that is just a remarkable fact. And it was a year ago today that we all came to the decision that we weren't going to have a full session. And here we are a year later. And in those 3 days that were left, we were able to move through and pass in both chambers this piece of legislation. We since, after a veto, came back and overrode it. But as the chairman noted, we learned a whole lot in the last year about the gaps and deficiencies that have existed, not only in our school system, but in the impact of, despite Herculean efforts to try and retain some level of learning in the midst of a pandemic. But we have a significant amount of work to do. And the work ahead is more important now than it has ever been as we start to reemerge from this crisis. I do want to make sure to start by thanking the incredible team at the Department of Legislative Services. They've been working around the clock for a second year to put this bill together. Because of the veto, the bill was not law. And so to draft any changes to the law required a quick turnaround in just weeks to try and take this bill, turn it into legislative language, get analysis done, draft legislation, get a fiscal note ready. It is just an amazing testament to the work and professionalism of our incredible DLS team. So as we've seen, the world has been totally and completely upended by this COVID-19 pandemic, and it's impacted every single facet of our lives. Few places, though, have had a more direct and immediate impact than our public schools and the students that they serve. Like all things that have been impacted by COVID, this impact has been disparate. And the students who the blueprint was most designed to support have certainly felt the brunt of distance learning and the resulting in what we know to be significant learning loss. That impact was unfortunately compounded by the veto of the blueprint last year, which delayed implementation by a year at a time when our most in need students would have benefited the most. But we are where we are, and we are here today because we have a path forward. So Senate Bill 965 is designed to make adjustments to account for these impacts of the pandemic and its delayed implementation. There are 5 main components of this bill, which I know that the Chairman of Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs will touch on, as will Rachel Heiss, to get in more detail. But I wanted to give sort of a high level of the 5 key parts. Part 1, there are significant technical changes throughout the original blueprint bill to account for the delayed implementation and the implementation as a result over the next decade. With that said, the funding in FY23 is full and was the original amount intended. So we are not delaying for a year. We are adjusting the implementation based on the new timeline. Second, we're addressing the digital divide between our most socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged systems by phasing in money to our base formula for technology improvements. I think certainly when we started with the blueprint, the aspect of the digital divide was not as highlighted as it has been over this last year. And it is obvious that we must have an urgency to have a sustainable plan moving forward. And that's what this bill provides. Third, we know that the American Rescue Plan passed at the federal level is providing significant funding to public education and will be expanded over the next few years. Senate Bill 965 tries to prioritize our state's fiscal health by specifying how those federal stimulus funds can be spent to reverse COVID-19 learning loss and align with the blueprint. Fourth, in this similar vein, we have new programs for summer school and intensive tutoring that are expanded throughout this bill. Real accountability is built in so that there are reporting requirements to ensure that the programs that we fund are making the gains that our students need. And finally, fifth, there is a significant incorporation of tending to students' socio-emotional needs with intensive mental health supports and counseling. I've seen it in my own children, and I know it has been exacerbated statewide, that COVID-19 has not only impacted educational attainment, but increased feelings of isolation amongst students that must urgently be addressed as they reemerge. So finally, the last sort of overarching note is that I think it's a really important narrative here that Senate Bill 965 is not intended to tinker around the edges or make small fixes. Those are going to be issues that we deal with for future legislative sessions. We're not trying to relitigate issues of contention from prior years. What we are trying to do is make sure that we target our supports for the students who need it most at a time of severe social emotional stress that has been caused by this pandemic, while we bridge the digital divide that has certainly led to disparate outcomes. So I thank the committee ahead of time for their urgent review of this legislation and look forward to moving this through expeditiously so that we can make sure that our students get the education that they most certainly deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Hand it over to the co-chairman of this event, Senator Pinsky.
Thank you, Senate President Ferguson, as well as Chair Gazzone and all the senators from the two committees. I too will be brief, even briefer. This bill primarily does two things. It updates it, as the Senate President said, and it also responds to the COVID crisis. And it has been a crisis. We've all seen it. We've heard about it from our constituents. We've probably witnessed it with our own children or grandchildren in terms of giving them support. And when it comes to giving support, you know, there are some families across the state where a parent was around to give that almost full-time support to the young person, the K through 12 student. Unfortunately, in some communities, not only wasn't there a parent around to give the support to the student, it was that very student who had to give support to other siblings to get through the day or get through the week. So obviously the COVID hit communities very differently, but I think if you across the board, many, if not all students were affected. Some affected more than others. I believe all students will experience learning loss, even those from upper middle class communities. And as I mentioned before, I think those in high poverty have been really crushed and are going to even be facing an exacerbated situation. And it you know, whether students with disabilities, where their special education instructor couldn't feel them, touch them, see them to give them the support, or students with ESOL students, English as a second language, I heard they were having a 30% more or 300% more learning loss than students who are not from a second language. So there are lots of challenges ahead of us. So a good part of this bill, as the Senate President said, has to do with quick services over the next 15 months or maybe 30 months in terms of tutoring and summer school. many of you recall from the original Kerwin bill, we had significant tutoring set for kindergarten through third grade. And the purpose was to make sure every child was at reading level by third grade, because if they're not, things spiral. So not only was that our vision for years now, with the COVID, many students have fallen behind, not just a grade behind, but probably more. But with that extra money for tutoring, for summer school, we, in this bill, ask for plans developed by the 24 jurisdictions. And we also have a significant measure of accountability. Just as with the original Kerwin legislation, we're not just saying spend this money, we're saying you need to be accountable, show us your plan, show us that you're keeping the efficacy of the legislation. And we're doing that also in this bill in front of us, in Senate Bill 965. We want to know what kind of tutoring they're using. There are 10 or 15 methodologies that have been approved. We want to know which one they're using. We want to make sure there is data at the beginning and data at the end, so we can see the value added. We want to also use this as a growing experience and a data collection, because if they're best practices over the next 12 or 15 months, we don't know when we're going to have to use this again. So we want to keep this very thorough and thoughtful and efficient use of state money. So that is a clear piece of this legislation. Let me close by saying what it's not. We spent 3 years on the Kerwin Commission, myself and some other people on this call, on this Zoom. And we heard from lots of people, and we incorporated many of their ideas. But I have to tell you, not every idea was incorporated or included. So there is probably a queue out the door of people who say, why not consider X or consider Y? I don't believe our thought was to reopen the Kerwin proposal, the 3 years work. And there are numbers of people who would like to do that. But that's not the purpose of this bill. It is to integrate the technology, address the next 20 to 30 or 35 months, and also to update the legislation and the formulas. So some people have some great ideas, but once you open that door, we're going to have lots of interest groups and ideas, whether it be in one type of instruction or another type of instruction, or changing courses in teacher preparation at the higher education level. And that was not our intended purpose. And it's we need to be particularly mindful, because we have a short turnaround time over the next week or two to get this moving, to ensure that our 24 jurisdictions get this extra support. We update the dates, and that our students actually thrive, which is what we want to do. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just go right into Rachel Heiss, Department of Legislative Services.
Thank you, and good afternoon. So I'm going to give you a summary of the bill that is not at like the 1,000 foot level, not at the 10,000 foot level, and then I'm happy to answer questions. So as Senator Ferguson and Senator Pinsky mentioned, a lot of what the bill is doing is adjusting dates and timelines to account for essentially a 1-year delay in the bill taking effect. And so any provisions where the due date has already passed, obviously had to be changed. And then dates that were in the immediate future, reports that were required, studies that needed to be done, programs that needed to get up and running, in many cases have been, the dates have been adjusted by a year. So for example, the Accountability and Implementation Board was supposed to adopt a comprehensive implementation plan by February 15th of this year. And so that date has now been moved to February 15th of next year, 2022. And then likewise, the school systems will then submit their reports to the AIB in the following June of 2022. So that's one example of a number of provisions in the bill that make those kinds of adjustments. anything that obviously, but anything that's not shown in this bill is not changed. So the dates are not changed. The when it takes effect is not changed. So just to be clear about that. It also makes a number of changes similarly to the funding formulas to account for the timing. And one of the biggest changes related to that is in the enrollment count that is used for the foundation formula, and also in maintenance of effort, the local maintenance of effort requirement. Under the blueprint legislation, current law, as of right now, is that enrollment is the greater of the fall enrollment or a 3-year rolling average. And so that is different than what we have been using for a number of years. Although we were using add-on grants to make up for declining enrollment. And so with the decline in enrollment in this past fall due to COVID-19, under what is now current law, the dip in enrollment from this fall would affect funding for the school systems for the next few years as that 3-year rolling average rolls through. And so what the bill is doing is it is excluding the fall 2020 enrollments from that 3-year rolling average. And that applies to both the foundation formula and to maintenance of effort and other related programs like guaranteed tax base. And so in the fiscal note, you'll see there's an increase in the foundation program in fiscal 23 and 24. And that is related to this enrollment adjustment for what we call the pandemic enrollment, increases state funding to the school systems in 23 and 24. Starting in fiscal 25 is where the educational technology funding that I think both Senator Pinsky and Senator Ferguson mentioned to address the digital divide that has been so apparent in the last year. And this provision adds approximately $200 per student to the foundation formula to provide for digital devices for students and teachers, to provide for broadband connectivity, and also other equipment and software and IT staff that are needed to help, as we all know how much we need our IT staff these days. That is added, it's phased up from fiscal 25 to fiscal 27. And again, in the fiscal note, you can see that that's where there are some larger increases in the foundation program funding. And that is related to phasing in the technology funding. And the phase-in begins in fiscal 25 because, as was mentioned, the additional federal funds, most recently from the American Recovery Plan, are available to school systems at a minimum until September of 2023, and then they can encumber them for the rest of that. So through fiscal 24, and potentially even into fiscal 25. So there are a good amount of federal funds available to the school systems. And I'll just point you to, in the fiscal note, Appendix 3 and Appendix 4 at the very end, show the amount of federal funds that the school systems are getting directly from the 3 primary COVID relief bills, including the most recent one. Another funding formula change in the bill that was, I think, also related to observations during the pandemic is the phase-in of the concentration of poverty grant. What the bill does is it accelerates the phase-in for the schools that are at the highest concentration of poverty, which is 80% and above. As you'll remember, in the original 2019 blueprint bill, the concentration of poverty grants were created, and the first funding went to the highest poverty schools at 80% or above, and they're receiving the personnel grants. And then that was for fiscal 20. They've been receiving them since fiscal 20. And then in 21, the concentration came down to 75%, and then in 22 in the budget, and in Kerwin it is down to 70%. It will keep going down to 55%. But the phase-in of the concentration of poverty per pupil grants, so there's per pupil funding that goes to these schools as well as the personnel grants. And that has not begun yet. It is to begin this current fiscal year for the highest concentration schools. The way that the original bill was drafted, the phase-in of the per pupil funding is the same percentage for every school, regardless each year, regardless of their concentration of poverty. And so what the bill is doing is it's saying, okay, we want to make sure that the schools with the highest concentration of poverty get to 100%. And so the bill gets them to their 100% sooner than under the original blueprint law. And then as the other schools come into the per pupil funding, they receive the same percentage and the same phase up to 100% as the 80% schools are getting. And so I think there's a little confusion about what that provision does. So hopefully that helps. The other thing there's a little confusion about, so I'm just going to go back for 1 second to the technology funding. Because we're adding money to the foundation per pupil, the formulas that are tied to the foundation per pupil, which include compensatory education, English language learners, and special education, are a percentage of the foundation amount. So when the foundation amount increases, in order to keep the funding level at the same level as was already agreed upon in the bill last year, the percentage of the formula it's decreasing as a percent of the per pupil foundation amount. So it looks like a decrease in the bill. So I understand why people think that's what's happening, but it's not what's happening. And if you look in the fiscal note, you can see that there is no reduction in funding to any of those programs under the bill. The other thing that the bill does relates to maintenance of effort and the calculation for the local governments and what they have to provide to the school systems. Again, the COVID-19 impact on enrollment is creating challenges with the way maintenance of effort is calculated. And so for fiscal 22, there's actually a provision in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act that essentially addresses the concern, so that even though enrollment is going down, school systems are still going to receive at least the same amount that they received from their county governments in fiscal 21. But for fiscal 23, it is also an issue for two reasons. One, because of the pandemic enrollment dip in the 3-year average. So we've addressed that and removed that enrollment from the calculation. The second is what year of appropriation to use for the county governments. In fiscal 22, some of them are being required to increase their appropriation in order for their school systems to receive the Hold Harmless grant. What the bill proposes is for fiscal 23 to calculate maintenance of effort using the fiscal 21 local appropriation. So essentially, kind of, again, sort of trying to skip over the unintended consequence in the formulas of what's going on due to COVID-19. And then just Senator Pinsky and Senator Ferguson, I think, covered this fairly well in terms of the additional programs that are being established and funded to address the learning loss and other losses related to COVID-19. And so it's a total of almost $250 million that is in the fiscal 21 and 22 budgets to provide funding for summer school programs, for supplemental tutoring and instruction, for the social emotional health and behavioral health related issues. And the bill towards the back has some requirements around those, and accountability and reporting requirements around those programs, and also how LEAs are using the federal funds they're receiving from related to COVID-19. So with that, I think I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Heiss. Questions? Senator Salling. You need to unmute, Senator.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, thank you for all that information. That is a ton of information you're giving us, but I would love if we have the opportunity to see some of these details. I think it'd be really good and helpful. There's a lot that you were talking about, the technical information, the federal funds. Be good to know how much of the federal funds are going that way and how we're going to use them in detail. So it'd be good to know that. The summer school programs, what kind of programs in detail, maybe if there's more, there less. I think there'd probably be more. So it'd be good to know that. And the social and emotional needs, some of the things that you're going to be doing for that, it'd be good to know also. So it'd be great if we could get that information. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I can just jump in for a second. We've already had a preliminary conversation with the 24 superintendents, asking them to begin to develop a plan for how many students they think they need to service and how many they can service over the summer, and then try to see how that fits with the allocation of any funds. The same thing with tutoring. We don't want this to be haphazard. We've already asked them informally, because this bill is not passed yet, to begin to think of how they will select students who need the tutoring. So we've planted the seed, Senator Salling, in the 24 local leaders, knowing this was likely to come, that they can start beginning to think about how they're going to do it.
Mr. Chairman, just to jump into, I would say that the fiscal note does have a pretty excellent summary of a lot of the detailed implementation with good and rich charts that lay out a lot of the components.
Mr. Chairman, you have a member.
Senator Washington.
Hi, thank you. Can't see my little hand when I raise it. Thank you, Rachel, as always, for this work. Just some technical support first. Is there a way, do you have a matrix, or I'm sure you're working on it, where the changes correspond to the page numbers? Because I was trying to follow through the page numbers of the bills with your explanations, and a lot of, I tried to do as much as I could over the weekend, but if you have a cheat sheet that would help us correspond the specific policy changes to where it appears in the bill, or is that someplace I haven't found yet?
Staff, we do have a working kind of matrix that we've been using as we were drafting the bill. So I think
Great.
I'll talk with them about, I think we can provide that. And if I could just take 1 second to just thank Senator Ferguson for thanking the DLS team, and just to put in a plug for the team. It takes a village to do this kind of work, especially so quickly, from bill drafting to the fiscal note writing to the budget analyst. So it's taken everyone.
Great. And so just for now, and I guess maybe later in the hearing, I'll have some other questions, but I'm looking at the early learning per pupil amount, and just remind us of, there's just some reductions over time there. Just remind us what those are about. And then there's also the, I appreciate the acceleration in the, I believe that would be some of the other adjustments. But there's just some reductions over time. So if you maybe could get back to me about what those are doing, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, can I just take a minute to just explain, because I think there is some confusion on this piece as well.
That would be great, thanks.
And so on the concentration of poverty grants, under what the Kerwin Commission proposed last year, there was sort of a certain amount of money each year that would go towards concentration of poverty grants.
Right.
And the question was, how much is needed for the personnel grants as we move through the concentrations, and then how much is left for per pupil grants, and then how do we phase those in?
Right.
And so in addressing the different phase-in to accelerate the phase-in for the highest concentration of poverty schools with the same amount of money in each year. For the most part, in fiscal 28, we did have to spend a little more money to get them to 100%. It means that the schools that the percentage in the next years, they're all going to receive the same percentage as they move through the phase-in. Percentage is actually a little bit lower than it was in the original bill. And so that does result in some small reductions in of new money, of additional money, as that phase-in happens. In fiscal 28, there is it costs a little more to make sure that all the 80% schools get to their full per pupil funding. And then that kind of trades off within fiscal 29. There's actually a little bit of savings. And then in fiscal 30, there are some savings because under the original plan, all of the money, 100% of the money was being allocated by fiscal 2030. And now this phase-in is sort of taking each set of schools and phasing them up over the same number of years. So it stretches it out a little bit longer.
So just that on page 8, the there is on line 5 for the personnel grant. So there's this a reduction. It's from 257 million to 248.
Yeah.
But then there's right. So that is a reduction. And is that why?
So it's actually not. So the
the
original amount, thank you for asking. The original personnel grant amount was $248,833. That is what was funded in fiscal 20 and fiscal 21. And in the bill last year, in the drafting, that amount was essentially updated for inflation. And to the 257,100. However, that is not what was funded in fiscal 21 or fiscal 22. And so the bill is simply kind of aligning back with what is actually in the budget for the personnel grants, which would sort of stay at this $248,833.
So is that like a drafting error, or I mean?
No.
So they're just readjusted, but that wasn't the original intent. As you might imagine, we've gotten emails about, hey, there's 11 million that was reduced. So I wanted an opportunity for the public to hear, what, kind of what happened. So you just said there was an adjustment for inflation, but that wasn't the original intent in the bill.
No, so in fiscal 22, the amount in the budget for personnel grants is $248,833.
That's what was appropriated.
Yes, that's what's available to be funded in fiscal 22.
Okay.
That amount could be increased for fiscal 23, but not for fiscal 22. So that was why it was changed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mm-hmm.
Senator McCray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure who this question will be proposed to, but I'm going to ask it, and then I guess whoever wants to answer it. Page 24, it delves into dual enrollment and expanded dual enrollment to apprenticeship opportunities. I know that we dealt with youth apprenticeships, I want to say several years ago. We expanded on it. I'm not sure that it's as successful as we wanted it to be. But when we are expanding apprenticeships into dual enrollment, can I just hear about the vision, if there are any clear examples that we're trying to model as we put this forward in this piece of legislation?
Well, maybe I can start and then.
That'd be great.
A number of years ago in Senate Bill 740, we made a major push to increase dual enrollment. That means while students in high school, they can also attend the community college at the same time. And while they could do it prior to the passage of that bill like 6 or 7 years ago, it was not well utilized. People didn't know they could do it. We, in the law passed by the legislature, again in Senate Bill 740, we told every high school they had to let every high school student know that it was available to them. Now, not everyone should take advantage of it. I mean, there are some, if they were failing their history, they couldn't take a college course in history. But after we made that very targeted attempt, I believe enrollment in community colleges, the high school student went up like 200%, maybe 300%. I mean, off the charts, and kids have really benefited from it. The senator, I think, I'm not sure he's on the call now, has suggested if we're encouraging dual enrollment for people to get an AA degree or to get credit-bearing courses, why not some training courses in career technology? So the idea here was to have a parallel path to credit academic, if you will, courses that if they are ready, given their high school experience and where they are and they're recommended, they should also be allowed to use that pathway to take technology courses through dual enrollment. Rachel, is that pretty close?
Yeah, yes, just with one clarification. So the amendments are really clarifying in the sense that on page 24 in lines 4 to 8, the intent of the bill last year was that non-credit programs that are taken through four-year and community college institutions that are non-credit but are towards a certificate or industry credential would be part of dual enrollment. On the and you can see on page 25, there's a amendment to define a dually enrolled student to clarify that includes non-credit. But apprenticeship sponsors are not, just to be clear, apprenticeship sponsors are in the language on page 24, which clarifies that the pathway for pursuing additional CTE mastery includes an apprenticeship sponsor. And apprenticeships, when they are, comprehensive and robust, they actually include the academic component as well as the vocational and technical component. So the apprenticeships aren't going to be funded through dual enrollment, just to be clear. Dual enrollment would only be related to the higher education institution.
I guess I'll make a comment, Mr. Chair. Especially as a person that went through an apprenticeship program, knowing that apprenticeship programs are more than likely things where you're not just getting the educational piece of it, you're actually getting the workforce component. I know that we did youth apprenticeships several years ago, but I think that some of the challenges that still present themselves to this day is first the liability pieces of it. We're not finding enough employers to be able to gain the opportunities for those folks that are 16 or 17 years old. 18 is usually that threshold, that trigger. I do agree that Baltimore City is one of the benefactors of dual enrollment from a college standpoint with BCCC, and the numbers, like you said, going off the chart and off the roof. But I do think that there are some things that we should be working out, and that's why I wanted to clearly understand examples or models that you may have seen in other states from that standpoint before we walk down a path that hasn't been proven successful at this moment. So that's my comment, and you heard my question. Thank you.
Senator Eckert, do you still have a question?
I do. Thank you very much. Real quickly, and thank you, Rachel, for the explanation. I'll probably get back to you with more questions, but do you have a chart like we had before that shows the impact to the local jurisdictions? That's my biggest concern. Again, with COVID, the locals, even with the money that's coming down, it's been challenging. And I'm trying to figure out, how you can put combinations of money together to make it work, because we do have some challenges with our educational system because of not being in school. But do we have that chart, and was it at the back of the fiscal note and I just missed it?
It is, but it's a long fiscal note, so I can understand. It's appendix 2 on page 23.
Okay.
has the estimated local impact, and it doesn't, it's really not in any significant way until really starting in fiscal 26, and that's just 15 million statewide.
Okay, and do we know how that compares to the previous bill? Is it the same amount, or have there?
So it would be 15. It would be 15 million more than the previous bill, starting in fiscal 26.
That's what I thought she said. I was hoping maybe I didn't hear that, but that's right. Yeah, because I'm just concerned about the local jurisdictions, because that's been the issue before. Anyway.
There are some savings in fiscal 22 for some of the counties because they aren't going to be required to pay the local share of all the formulas in fiscal 22. So that does statewide save counties almost $70 million in the upcoming fiscal year.
Okay, thank you very much. I will look at those and get back to you. Thank you. Thank you, Ms.
Back to Senator Washington for a question.
Thank you. Rachel or anyone, on page 30, it looks like I'm just trying to understand. It looks like there's some language attempting to clarify the amendment, Senator King's amendment around, making sure that if we can't pay for this, we can sort of limit things to inflation. Can you go through that? Because I'm looking at each of the lines. Could you just sort of give a summary about how that works? Basically line 27 through 21 through 27, if that's possible. Can you?
Would you like me to do that?
Could you do that?
Sure.
Explain. Yeah.
Yes, please, Rachel.
Yeah.
Sure. So, so we're looking at it's section 19 from last year's bill.
Right.
And you can see in line 16, the words for fiscal year 22 are being deleted. So this is really mostly a technical clarifying amendment to make it clear that this checkpoint or check-in on the revenues is an annual check-in, not just for fiscal 22. And so it starts the check-in for fiscal 23, and it's a comparison of estimated revenue, general fund revenues in fiscal 23 in the March estimate compared to the December estimate. And if that is drops by more than 7.5%. Then all of the formulas and funding are limited to inflation.
Okay.
From that point forward.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't know how long we would have the Senate President, so I was hoping to be able to ask the Senate President a couple questions. And first of all, I really appreciate your overview and your breaking it down into those 5 parts. That's always really helpful. And you caught my attention, especially on the 5th part of the bill when you talked about support for students in the area of mental health. So my question is, and I'm taking it more at 100,000 foot level, and I realize this bill may not address it, but I didn't know if you thought maybe there were parts in the bill that do address it. Obviously, when the Chair Pinsky mentioned, the 3 years of work on Kerwin to arrive at this point. Of course, we didn't know about the impact of the pandemic and what that impact would have on student learning, the role of parents, and then the impact, the mental health impact. So I guess my question is, as you're approaching it, Mr. President, and again, I know we're focused on this, but maybe there are parts in here that support it. Do you see anything in the bill that would actually further support the role of parents, given that so much more, as you yourself have experienced, have been put on parents with the virtual learning? And when it comes to the mental health services, I guess I wanted to see what you thought would be most helpful, and if there was any consideration of giving the locals as much flexibility to keep in programs that actually may be providing some stability for students. And I will note, having SROs in most local school districts have been a source of stability, recognizing it might be an issue in certain local jurisdictions that they might want to handle themselves. So I just wanted to bring, again, role of parents, especially the parents I'm hearing from and what's been on them, and two, the mental health services that you
Yeah, I
think
knew that one.
full, tied to some consistency with what may be already working at the local level.
Sure. I mean, I guess there's sort of two parts to the question there. One of the intents of the bill is to expedite immediate use of social and emotional dollars. So within one of the components that was added through the legislative process last year was this consortium, which is still an incredibly important part of the long-term success of this bill. The consortium around providing mental, social, emotional supports. But what we know is that there is a higher and targeted need immediately as kids return. And so we are providing additional flexibility so that districts have the resources that are necessary for the school psychologists, for the healthcare professionals, to be able to deploy this upcoming year as there has been this more acute problem as kids start to reemerge. The consortium is still operational, it could still start to get working, but we didn't want to take the time that's necessary to develop that whole program when we know that those needs are immediate right now. And so those dollars are available for immediate supports. I'd also say the community school component of this, of course, that's not every school, but we know where there are the most vulnerabilities or where our schools are in highest need. And one of the key components of a successful community school is bringing the family and kids together and servicing the needs for the family and children. And I think that's one of the beauties and most important aspects of this entire program, is that a recognition of that the education of a child in today's world is not just about reading and math. It's about really making sure that a child is has the capacity to learn and has the supports they need throughout their entire experience. And so I think the additional focus on the community supports through the community school program will be enormously helpful for this component. I'd also say the tutoring, while the tutoring is very much going to be focused on academic needs, when you have small group tutoring, that's when kids are most apt to provide feedback about their own personal experience. And so as we invest more in these small group tutoring programs in summer school, I think you'll be able to start to highlight a number of students who are having greater issues that may be helpful to have a referral to a school psychologist or to a related professional who can have a conversation with them about what they're feeling and experiencing. So I would say it's in a variety of different places, and is a core priority for this to be successful in the long run. I don't know, Rachel, is there anything else that I missed that you wanted to?
The impact on parents?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's something specifically to parents. Certainly we've tried and used the federal dollars in the Relief Act and in many other places. I know with the incoming federal dollars, making more having mental health services be more accessible overall. I wouldn't say that this is targeted towards parents in any way. Certainly districts, as they have more flexible dollars, will be able to do specific targeted outreach to parents, but I don't think that from a state level, we haven't sort of mandated anything on districts related to parents.
Okay. Senator Gazone, Chairman Gazone, should we move to the witnesses? You want to call the first?
You bet. You bet.
There are a couple of favorable and then favorable with amendments.
Right. I believe the first just favorable is Allison Perkins Cohen.
Hello, can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Senate President, Chair Pinsky, Chair Gazone, and members of the committee. It's great to see your faces today, even if just remotely. I'm Allison Perkins Cohen, Chief of Staff of Baltimore City Public Schools. On behalf of Dr. Santelises and our Board of Commissioners, thank you for this opportunity to express our support for SB 965. Also, I want to thank you all for your leadership in last year's historic passage of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Your actions and commitment were important then, but their importance have only increased exponentially given the unprecedented events of the last year and the subsequent impact on public education. That still reverberates today and will be reverberating for years to come. SB 965 seeks to ensure a smooth implementation of the Kirwan Commission's priorities, namely ensuring that every young person in Maryland, regardless of their zip code, has the opportunity to reach their full potential. As you know, it's now been more than 4 years since the APA's adequacy study for the Kirwan Commission indicated that city schools needed an additional $358 million annually to ensure an adequate education for Baltimore students. Similarly, the Department of Legislative Services found that if the inflation factor had been implemented for the Thornton funding, city schools would be receiving an additional $290 million per year to support our students. What's more, in addition to the dramatic underfunding of operations, City Schools' 2012 Jacobs report documented a $2.5 billion cost to bring all of our buildings up to acceptable standards. And the overall cost that today would translate to a cost of about $3 billion. We can't wait any longer, and we are grateful to see that SB 965 reflects the same sense of urgency that we feel. We have a long road ahead, and it's gotten even longer during the pandemic. Specifically, the bill recognizes the need to accelerate resources to districts with the highest concentrations of poverty in a number of ways. It ensures that the schools with 80% poverty will still receive their per pupil grants beginning in FY22. It increases the percentage of the per pupil for those grants from 12.7 to 16% per pupil. It reduces the span of time needed to reach 100% of the grants from the original 9 years to 7 years. These are important provisions, and as you prepare to deliberate on the legislation, we hope you will uphold them and possibly even expand those provisions by further accelerating implementation of the per pupil for concentration.
Please wrap up your testimony.
And the full phase of Kirwan. So thank you so much for letting me speak, and we will have some technical changes that we'll be requesting, but we respectfully urge you to support SB 965.
Thank you very much. John Willems.
Good afternoon, chairs, vice chairs, members of the esteemed committees. John Willems, representing the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, testifying today in strong support of the immediate passage of this legislation. I think you've heard forceful and eloquent testimony, particularly from Senate President Ferguson and Senator Pinsky. A wonderful outline of the bill by Rachel Heiss. I would say, what would we do without Rachel Heiss? Isn't that so? And this is a wonderful and reasonable bill. It does not relitigate the issues that arose in 2018 and 2019 as we were working through the final phases of drafting the blueprint and the funding work group, and appreciate Senator Pinsky's recognition of that. And we don't want to relitigate or reopen the legislation. We greatly appreciate the reasonable adjustments, technical changes, certainly ensuring and reasonably adjusting maintenance of effort, adjusting for enrollment, adjusting the foundation to address the digital divide, and then the additional provisions that are paramount in recognition of the COVID-19 pandemic and the negative impacts on student learning in terms of summer school and supplemental instruction. Those provisions seem to be very reasonable, well-crafted, discretion and accountability well-balanced. And again, we greatly appreciate that and urge an immediate and prompt passage of this legislation to fully launch the blueprint for Maryland's future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank Pettinella.
Hello. Good afternoon, chairs and members of the committees. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Frank Pettinella, and I'm a senior education advocate for the ACLU of Maryland. We represent a class of plaintiffs in the Bradford versus the State Board of Education lawsuit, which is actively being litigated to ensure that the constitutional right of adequate education funding for Baltimore students is fulfilled. We appreciate the effort put into the blueprint bill and the revisions, and we agree with the omission of the enrollment count for school year 2021, the MOE revision. We agree with the increase in the foundation to account for digital and technology, and we agree with the faster phase in the concentration of poverty per pupil. In the near term, the legislature's work to increase education funding in FY22, coupled with the large infusion of federal dollars, will put school districts in a much better position to address the impact of the pandemic and also the impact of significant underfunding caused by the cut to the Thornton formula over a decade ago. The amendment that we are seeking in this bill has to do with the mid-term and long-term implications of the blueprint formula and whether or not it will meet the state constitutional standard for funding adequacy. We oppose the reduction to the weights for the compensatory education and ELL in the original bill, and we further oppose the reduction to the weights in this revision. Also, the projected funding for special education for Baltimore City schools 10 years from now in the future barely meets what is being spent by the district now. The development of the blueprints formula mostly happened over a 2-month period at the end of 2019, and not many details are known about how the foundation and the weights were determined. Consequently, we are asking for an amendment to the bill to require MSTE and DLS to provide an adequacy analysis of the blueprint formula with stakeholder involvement. Study must employ a similar cost methodology used by APA in the study to provide an accurate analysis of the formula. To close, this bill is an enormous step forward, and with our amendment, we will ensure that there will be a good faith effort to continue collaborating on the constitutional guarantee to ensure funding adequacy for all students in Maryland. We urge the committees to vote favorably on SB 965 with our amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina Pashu.
Christina Push.
Push. I was wondering if she wasn't there because I called her name wrong.
I don't see her, Senator.
Okay. Maritza Solano. You see her? Okay, we'll just keep going. Cheryl Boast.
Good afternoon, Chair Gazzoni, Chair Pinsky, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee. My name is Cheryl Boast, and I'm proud to be an educator from Baltimore County, serving as the president for the Maryland State Education Association. On behalf of our over 76,000 members, I want to thank those of you who helped pass the blueprint during the closing days of the session last year and worked very hard to override the governor's veto. On behalf of our students and our educators, thank you so much. And we believe this bill, Senate Bill 965, goes even further to helping our students and in dealing with the crisis that is right in front of them. We are supporting with amendments and by making several modest amendments to increase equity in the quality of recovery programs for students, we can help the blueprint better meet this moment during the pandemic for our students in schools. We did provide written testimony and our amendments are listed there, but this bill can help facilitate the best possible academic recovery programs for students through ensuring high levels of individual attention for students from educators who best know them, and high quality assessments and safe learning conditions. You heard Senate President Ferguson talk about tutoring. One of our items here is not to provide for outsourcing of tutoring. The best folks to tutor our students and then make that connection into the fall, or the very people who work with them, are paraeducators, our teachers, our counselors, as we're dealing with also the social emotional learning, not just academic learning. We also don't want to increase the amount of assessments. And so you'll see our amendment there that talks about these should be district delivered assessments. And in some cases, based on the subject, possibly teacher made assessments. I can tell you as an elementary school teacher, In primary grades, there's a DIBELS program that many of our educators already use that helps to diagnose where our students are lacking in some of their English language arts. So we wouldn't want to get a state standardized test or develop something new. It is really to provide that information in a timely manner for the teachers so that they can adjust their instructional practices. We also want to look at reasonable steps to protect the physical and social emotional health of educators. And that includes making sure that we're still holding up to the safe and healthy standards as we're still in the pandemic, making sure our schools can facilitate summer school. The basic thing is air conditioning, and that we can—
Please wrap up your
employ our
testimony.
service. Thank you. And lastly, we should ensure an equitable and predictable implementation of the blueprint and its funding. So you will see amendments there regarding the concentration of poverty. So we urge a favorable vote for Senate Bill 965, and we once again thank you for your investment in our public schools.
Thank you very much. Samoya Gardner.
Good afternoon, Chairs Pinsky and Gazzoni, Vice Chairs Kagan and Rosapep, and members of the Senate Education, Health, Environmental Affairs, and Budget and Taxation Committees. For the record, I'm Shamoya Gardner, representing Strong Schools, Maryland. We've built power with more than 30,000 Maryland residents over the last 4 years to support and strengthen efforts to pass the blueprint for Maryland's future because our kids could not wait. And because Maryland could not afford to repeat its longstanding history of underfunding school communities already burdened by economic oppression. Senate Bill 965 makes many of the changes we would have requested be made to ensure the effective implementation of the blueprint, and we request a favorable report with the following amendments. The first is on funding equity. We ask that you do not delay the development of a new methodology to calculate the number of students experiencing poverty in schools. The current undercounting hurts students from families with undocumented or mixed residency status in the US who are primarily Latino, African, and Caribbean immigrants. These are the children of the exact same adults who may no longer be eligible for the EITC benefits that you all fought hard to extend. There are intergenerational consequences to delaying action here. In the vein of resource equity for communities of color and communities experiencing poverty across the state, we're also asking for the refunding of the concentration of poverty personnel grants passed in HB 1300 at those levels, and that you all do not decrease the phase-in of the weighted categories in the formula. We understand this was done to keep the funding levels the same as they were agreed upon in HB 1300, but the need is no longer the same. Attempting to keep the funding the same requires the state deliberately cut off funding for vulnerable student groups who the blueprint was passed to help in the first place, especially untimely when we know that we have excesses in the blueprint fund and federal aid coming. We should also clarify the fiscal trigger provision to either be conducted annually or clarify the conditions under which funding increases can resume. Otherwise, there is vagueness which could potentially leave way for conditions that'll allow folks to politicize the implementation of the blueprint further down the line. We also recommend that you don't further burden students receiving transitional supplemental instruction with additional standardized testing. Instead, leverage the existing data that is there to determine student growth. Use this as an opportunity to create a reporting structure for the state board to share information with the general public.
Please wrap up your
about the use of
testimony.
these funds. And we remain concerned about the relative authority of new and existing oversight bodies like the AIB and State Board of Education. Request that you clarify that. All in all, we request a favorable report on this bill, and thank you so much for the work you have done on the blueprint.
Thank you. So are either Ms. Push or Solano, have they arrived? Are they on the scene?
No, Senator.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, before
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, before you entertain questions for the panelists, the witnesses, let me just share to those listening. There was a sign up, and we had to cut off the number of witnesses because we have a hard stop at 5 o'clock. So if people wanted to testify but weren't offered the link because of time, we still encourage your amendments to be forwarded to the committee councils or to the two committees. So it was nothing other than a time constraint. And obviously, two of the witnesses who had said yes are, for whatever reason, unavailable to be here. And again, we have many of us have another meeting at 5 o'clock. So We did not try to close off testimony. It was just merely a standard of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the senators? Okay, well, seeing none, I think that'll conclude the hearing for today. Chair Pinsky, any last comments?
No, we appreciate everyone's paying attention and being interested in this. Clearly, this is a different scenario. We have a bit less time, as the Senate President shared. We couldn't start preparing this bill until the other override had taken place. So please offer amendments. The two committees will be taking it up this week and hopefully move it fairly rapidly. So I want to thank everyone for engaging in this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, a big debt of gratitude to you and all the years that you've been putting into this, and to the staff and everyone who's been engaged, all the citizens and activists. It's quite an effort, and I think we continue to have some good things moving forward.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
I just got
Senator
a
King.
text message that Chris Push never got the link to testify. So just wanted to let you know that she had a reason for not being there.
Right, sure. Well, as we all know and have experienced some of the technical
Happens.
of the last year. So, but we'll make sure if she gets information to us, we'll obviously forward it to both committees.
I'll let her know that.
Terrific. Okay, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.